Now for the time you all have been waiting for. Godzilla vs. Cthulhu, or more specifically, part 2 to this, which is Godzilla scaling, and the conclusion to this epic battle. Now, like the first part, which goes over Cthulhu scaling, I'll be going over Godzilla scaling, and then I'll be determining who will win between these two. Now, I don't really want to take too much time for this intro, since you guys, already get the gist of the video and how it works. So we're going to go ahead and jump straight into scaling for Godzilla. Now, just like Cthulhu, we're going to be using comp versions for Godzilla, but mainly Godzilla in Hell, Heisei Godzilla, and Ultima. Now for Ultima will mainly just be for the hacks and not really for the scaling. And Heisei Godzilla and GIH will both be used for scaling and hacks. But with that taken care of, let's end this debate on who's stronger between Godzilla, the King of the Monsters, or Cthulhu. Now as most of you know, Godzilla in Hell will be our main source of scaling for Godzilla since he's the strongest Godzilla. But in order to find out how Godzilla would compare to Cthulhu, we need to go over his feats first. Now I have made 2 videos on Godzilla in Hell before, but I'm going to go over them again for anyone who's new here or just wants to be retold the arguments. Now I think we should probably start just from issue 3 and then work our way to issue 5 since that's when we start getting the scaling stuff for Godzilla. Now one of the first things we see in issue 3 is Godzilla fighting Space Godzilla. In the fight, both are shown to be equal against each other and eventually clash beings that blow up the planet. What's more impressive about blowing up the Earth, though, is that it's stated that the explosion from the planet reached the moon. This would result in at least dwarf star levels of energy, and Godzilla would scale to this because Godzilla is incapable of dying due to those restrictions because of what happened in 1998. But you could get this feat even higher, but I will go over that later. Now, after the planet was blown up, Godzilla meets God Mountain. It is here that God requests Godzilla's help in his battle against Hell, but Godzilla declines, so he is sent to Hell. Here in Hell, it is shown that Space Godzilla's come back to life as the devil and starts to bully Godzilla. It is then that Godzilla receives an amp from God, and with this amp, Godzilla pulls a Broly and walks through Space Godzilla's attack and kills him. Godzilla then turns his attention to the portal that leads back to God, but instead of submitting, Godzilla instead destroys the portal, which ultimately kills God, and he obtains his power. Now, remember earlier how I said we could get Godzilla and Space Godzilla blowing up the Earth to a higher level? Well, in the description of issue 3, it's actually stated that Space Godzilla is rematching Godzilla. So what does this exactly mean? Well, this would mean that this Space Godzilla is the same one that Heisei Godzilla fought before. This is impressive for many reasons. For starters, Space Godzilla transcends physics, which you could argue with being the cosmology, but he also has a thing called supergravity. Now, supergravity is a high-dimensional thing that Space Godzilla uses, so this would be high-dimensional to the cosmology. Now, the cosmology would be the same as the Showa era, because Heisei Godzilla is just an alternate timeline of the Showa era, meaning it would just contain the 4th-dimensional spaces inside an infinite-sized universe. Now, Space Godzilla both transcends this and is high-dimensional to it, so this would make him at least 5th dimension. But that's not as high you get. For this to get higher, we would have to turn back to God Mountain, and God Mountain is stated to view the entire IDW cosmology as fiction and himself as infinite. Now this is pretty impressive on its own, but this should also apply to Hell's cosmology, since both Heaven and Hell exist on the same plane of existence. This can easily get 5th dimensional on its own, but the IDW cosmology for Godzilla actually contains things like 5th dimensional beings. One of these beings is known as Lord Dracon. Now, Lord Dracon destroyed the Morphin Grid, which is stated to be unbounded by the Power Rangers cosmology, but we also know that the grid is unused to interacting with the 4th dimension, so it should overall be 5th dimensional scaling. Now, you might be asking how this is all canon to Godzilla, but the Power Rangers are linked to Godzilla due to the panel showing Rita in between Godzilla dimensions, and God is above this is viewing everything as finite, so we can bump this up to 6th dimensional since he's viewing a 5th dimensional being as finite and himself is infinitely above that. Now, when Godzilla and Space Godzilla blew up Earth, it was also stated that this destroyed the entire dimension, or one of the layers of Hell, created by Lucifer, who is above the cosmology, like God is. But we also know that a description by Buster Moody also quite literally states that Godzilla and Space Godzilla are fighting in Hell. So, it's pretty impressive. But in terms of issue 3, that's mostly everything there is for scaling, so let's move on to issue 4. Now, a common thing a lot of people seem to say is that Godzilla didn't kill God Mountain because of these 2 statements. But I do have my disagreements about this, and there's 2 main reasons for it. The first thing is that there are more statements saying Godzilla killed God Mountain and absorbed his power into himself, rather than more statements saying that he didn't kill God Mountain. Now, I think it's pretty obvious, but if there are more statements saying a character did this, then less statements saying he did something else, I'm gonna take the side that has more statements going for it. Now the other thing we have to look at is the narrative for Godzilla in Hell. One statement says Godzilla absorbed God's power into himself and made his new base, continuing into issue 4. Now how would this be possible if he didn't kill God? We also know that the main story of Godzilla in Hell is that Godzilla overcomes the challenges, those being God and the challenges of Hell. There's also things in the comic itself in issue 5 that straight up say he is stronger than God, but I'll cover that after we cover issue 4. Now in issue 4, Godzilla fights against Destroyer and Ghidorah, and is shown to have beaten them before they resurrected. Now unfortunately they don't have the same statements like Space Godzilla does, that being a rematch, but you can infer that they are the same incarnations as the Heisei era, because the point of Godzilla in Hell is, once again, overcoming his challenges, which includes guys like Destroyer and Ghidorah. Not to mention, if Space Godzilla was a rematch, then why wouldn't Ghidorah and Destroyer be, since they are all in Hell? It's also stated that Destroyer and Ghidorah are Godzilla's greatest foes, so this actually upskill Space Godzilla and God Mountain already. Now, in the description for issue 4 of Godzilla in Hell, it's actually stated that there's a wall, which is an impenetrable wall. Now, later on, we see that this wall takes the combined efforts of Godzilla, Destroyer, and Ghidorah to destroy the wall, which, as I already stated to be before, is impenetrable. Now once that this wall is destroyed, Godzilla actually traverses through it, and that's when we get to the final issue. In issue 5, we are then introduced to God Demon, who is a ruler of Hell itself. When Godzilla tries to attack God Demon, he's actually incapable of doing anything to him, thus Godzilla surrenders himself to Hell and absorbs the Hellbats, which creates a brand new form for him. This allows Godzilla to straight up annihilate God Demon with a single blast, killing him. Now this is pretty impressive because the description of issue 5 states that God Demon is Godzilla's strongest challenge yet, so by this point, he's above everyone in the verse. Now, let me make something very clear here. God Demon is not Yog-Sothoth. There's a statement going around that says, if you want it to be Yog-Sothoth, then it can be, but in the script, they actually call it God Demon, and they also say that it's just a monster that sits on top of the gate, and you can interpret it to be whatever you want. Now, if you want to be funny and say it's Yog-Sothoth, go for it. But in all honesty, he's not Yog-Sothoth, so don't go around trying to spread a lie. Be like, this is actually Yog-Sothoth and Godzilla one-shot it. Now moving back to the final pages of issue 5, it's stated that Godzilla has become so strong that no one is capable of taking victory from him, and once he returns back to Earth and the real world, it's stated by Buddha that Godzilla has become so strong he's basically a tier above everyone else, as angels, demons, heaven, and hell are nothing to his power anymore. But we're not done with GIH just yet. That's just the stuff in his own comic. We have things like crossovers. Now, there's a game that some of you are probably familiar with, and that being Dungeons & Dragons. Now, Dungeons & Dragons had a crossover with Godzilla recently called Godzilla Here They Be Dragons, which would actually include D&D as part of the Godzilla cosmology. The reason that this is contained inside of IDW Godzilla is because by having a crossover with Godzilla, it implements himself into the cosmology. Now, Dungeons & Dragons is pretty broken as covered in the last video of Godzilla vs. Cthulhu, so I won't go over everything again, but I will go over the important stuff like the Far Realm and the stronger gods that I left out in Cthulhu's part. Now, the Far Realm is stated to be beyond the concepts of dimensions, and that there are infinite higher dimensions in the D&D multiverse. It's also stated that the concepts of Dungeons & Dragons are nothing to the Far Realm, which would easily put the Far Realm at High Outer. Now, the Far Realm is so high above the cosmology that gods like the Immortals cannot comprehend something on its level. Now, there's a god called Ao, and Ao is stated to be beyond the concepts of divine reigns, and exists beyond the concepts that bound all deities in Dungeons & Dragons, and is also considered an order of magnitude beyond any god within Dungeons & Dragons. Now, there's another deity called Luminous Being, and Luminous Being is visited by Ao, and it is then revealed that Luminous Being created everything in the Dungeons & Dragons multiverse, so he would just speak further into High Outer. Now, Godzilla is stated to be incapable of being killed by anything in Dungeons & Dragons, however, the source of the scan is pretty fishy since it's by armadillo droppings, which doesn't tell us who wrote the stories of this. However, even without the scan, there's still ways to put Godzilla above Dungeons & Dragons. Since we know Dungeons & Dragons is contained inside of the IDW Godzilla multiverse, and God Demon is stated the strongest, you can use that. There's also a statement saying that Godzilla can destroy the entirety of the IDW Godzilla universe, which includes D&D. Regardless of if you say it is IDW Godzilla's universe or the IDW Megaverse, it still includes Dungeons & Dragons either way. Now, I personally argued this statement to be the IDW Megaverse, but like I said, it doesn't really matter. So overall, where would Godzilla scale from this? Now overall, Godzilla would get out of the High Outer pretty easily, but what about attacks? As we know, you could still lose a fight if you don't have good hacks, and even if you have better scaling. So let's go over his hacks. In terms of hacks, his Godzilla constantly grows stronger, He resists existence erasure and has casualty type 1. Godzilla's true form is energy, so you literally can't kill him since energy cannot be created or destroyed. We know that God Mountain is a concept of love, and although the scan is fake, Basumudi does say that the words of the scan itself are fine. Godzilla has things like matter, space-time, and casualty manipulation. He's capable of breaking the laws of physics. He has time-minute dimensional travel and time travel. He's capable of rewriting the laws of nature. His atomic breath can cause ruptures in space-time. His atomic breath is capable of destroying space-time and casualty. Greater gods can recover from any kind of damage that is dealt to them, which this includes attacks that are capable of erasing you on conceptual levels. All gods in D&D are concepts and symbols. Gods manipulate chaos and law. Greater gods can kill things with a thought, arrange fate in a way that the opponent dies a horrible death, and are omniscient to the point where they know their opponent's next move just by sheer knowledge. Wishes can undo actions. Demigods and higher rank gods can bend reality based on their portfolios and domains. And true naming magic encompasses creation and reality on its entirety. Disbelief convinces the summoner that things around them don't exist, and the things in question can't harm the caster as long as the spell is active. There's irresistible dance and pain. A syllable of detachment removes all saves which are resistances. Druzy K converts the target into dust, and Abjura sends beings back to their plane of existence, and Syllable of Exile sends the target into a confused pocket dimension. Now, gods can depower any number of other gods with will alone. Gods can force a being to undergo erasure. Now, gods also possess knowledge of any event in the future that will affect them and develop counters to those events. But Godzilla would resist and be above all the hacks I just previously mentioned in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, since he's above everybody in the verse. Now we head on to the conclusions. And now it's time to determine who would win between the King of the Monsters himself or a god from the void. And honestly, I think Godzilla kind of demolishes Cthulhu. Yes, they are both in the same tier of power, but here's my reasoning on why Godzilla would slap Cthulhu. Now remember in the last video how I said Cthulhu is a greater god? Well, we know that Ao is beyond that, and Luminous Being is even further beyond that level of power, and Godzilla is just above that. Not to mention Ao is beyond the concepts that bind the greater gods, so Godzilla is conceptually above Cthulhu. Now Godzilla also just has better showings, it is deeper into high outer than Cthulhu is. Godzilla's hacks are also just better than Cthulhu's as well, being able to grow stronger as he fights, adapts to your opponents, resists anything Cthulhu could throw at him, and so much more. So it's not really much of a shock that Godzilla would wreck Cthulhu. Now by no means am I calling Cthulhu weak, but I'm just saying that Godzilla is broken. So with this being said, I have Godzilla slamming Cthulhu. But what if Godzilla faced someone else in the Cthulhu mythos? Someone who is the strongest in the verse, and is the verse itself. His name is Yog-Sothoth.